So actually, yes, let's call it to order. So I'll call to order the ad hoc committee meeting at 7:04 a.m.
Can I just take a moment to respond to Ann before?
Absolutely.
You know, Ann, when you said that at the last meeting, I was I'm just going to say that it was an interesting idea, and but I didn't know where it came from. You know, I don't mean that it came from anywhere, but I just wasn't sure that I was on the same page. And that was the first thing that Leaper said. That it was
Oh,
an
really?
interesting idea.
I said, you know, Ann's been doing this a while, and I should
but
follow her
I didn't
lead.
know where it came from. You know, I don't mean that it came
That's
from
exactly
anywhere,
what
but
I thought.
I just wasn't
So,
sure that I was on the same page.
She said the
And that
same
was the
thing, and I
first
thought,
thing that
well,
Leaper said. That it was
I
an
really?
interesting
I
idea.
said, you know,
Oh.
Ann's been doing this a while, and I
It's
should
just
follow
the
her lead.
legislative process. You know,
Yeah.
if you look at it from the legislator's point of view, it makes sense. They want things to move, and they use the putting up a bill as a way to initiate stuff as much as anything else. They don't necessarily always agree with what's in there. They just use the process, you know, and that's what I was thinking. But anyhow.
All right, so let's do roll call, and then we'll get to talking about all of these things so soon. Chloe, do you want to do the roll call, or do you want me to just read it out from Zoom?
Absolutely, no, I can do it. I'm just going to go with on my screen who I can see first. So Catherine Rowe, Kristen Besega.
Good morning.
Ann Deschelle.
Here.
Rebecca Good.
Here.
Jennifer Rodriguez.
Here.
Cynthia Ritchie.
Here.
And Shannon Merriman.
Here.
Welcome, everyone.
Thanks, Chloe. Okay, so on our agenda for this morning, under items for discussion, we have options for alternate pathways, but I also wanted to put forward the placeholder legislation that was brought up before, because it would give legislators something to look at, to know that we're working on it. The legislation I've titled it as Legislative Proposal A. I didn't know what else to call it. So everyone should have that shared document or that document shared with you on email. Dr. Ritchie.
You're on mute, Cynthia.
So sorry, I just want to back up a little bit. I think in the beginning of this first subcommittee meeting, the plan was to appoint a chair of the subcommittee. Do we need to do that step first before we get right into the agenda?
Okay. So at the last subcommittee meeting, I was appointed chair.
I'm sorry, I totally missed that, but
That's okay. Yeah. I want to say it was probably like 20 minutes before the end of the last subcommittee meeting, because the beginning was actually the full board working on the response to, I forget the name of the bill, the one that went up in education.
That's fine. Committee. I missed the end of that meeting, so thank you for clarifying, and now I understand. So let's move forward. Thank you.
Oh no, thanks.
It was State Bill 1392, just for context. That's what we were working on, instead of really doing the work that we were charged to do. But I just want to I have a suggestion, and I don't know if it makes any sense, but in light of the testimonies yesterday, and in light of what Ann has shared and what Representative Leaper said, that we were supposed to have this done by January 31st, right? That's what she said. That's how the whole thing started off. I watched the whole thing, soup to nuts. So I'm wondering, and Shannon had recommended this last time, I'm wondering if we should take that State Bill 1392 and like further develop it. And like we already have the bridge, and to Ann's point, we have talked about it. Instead of putting a placeholder bill in, maybe we should actually try to do the work and try to get something together. I'm just throwing that out there, because at this point, a placeholder is going to push through legislation that may not necessarily meet the needs. And for me, you know, I have personal opinions, but I'm here to represent AACT, the publics. So, you know, that's, I just want to, so I have some conflicted ideas here. But I do think that, you know, we really do need to have some flexibility, but we also need to be able to have the data for Kate. And I don't want to, and I can tell you what the feedback is from the students about the bridge. And I don't want scores to start going down because students aren't working as hard. So, but I think I'm just making a recommendation that we actually start doing the work instead of focusing on a placeholder. That's just an idea.
Yeah, so let me share with you the agenda in case you haven't gotten a chance to look at it. Wow, so many tabs. One moment. That is next on my agenda. So if we could talk about this bill, the legislative proposal A, then we'd be able to give something to the legislator and then notice the other items on the list. Those are actually the work we're trying to get to. So if you would like to propose just changing the order of the agenda so we talk about the other things first, that would be amenable.
Chloe has her hand up.
Yeah, can I just clarify? So just to make sure that we're aligned with the statute, any legislative proposals have to go through the State Board of Ed. So just making sure I reiterate that. So if there's any like language or proposals or recommendations, they have to go through the State Board of Ed.
Shannon.
Yeah, question, I guess, about that. If we're in a posture where we have to respond to something with more agility because the legislature's already put something forward, that seems to hamstring us quite significantly to have to wait and go to the state board. I mean, does this kind of play out differently when there's something that has like a time sensitivity, or do we have to go through the state board every time? And does it force our hand to then respond as individuals because we can't respond as a board? I'm like, that's what I think I'm worried about, because otherwise we're going to miss the window.
My understanding is that it is the latter. It has to go through the State Board of Ed because that's the process that was legislated. So, I mean, the State Board of Ed, if they make any decisions about certification, would have to go through this board as well. But any legislative proposals per the statute.
Could we ask the state board to have an emergency meeting in this case? Because I mean, they're just kind of there as this like passive third party that we have to now navigate. And I just feel like we've got to figure out a strategy for making sure we do that step in as timely a way as possible.
I don't know the answer to that, but we could talk about
Chloe,
it.
I'd be interested in understanding, because we already like we as a board, like Jennifer went and made a recommendation publicly yesterday on our behalf, and that did not go through the State Board of Ed, though I understand legislation like recommendations would need, or legislation, I guess. I'm not sure how that works, right? We did a recommendation, it didn't go through the State Board of Ed. Now based on that, we've like been asked to, this is actually part of the work that we're trying to do. So it seems like then did we make a misstep by doing the recommendation before at least previewing that with the State Board of Ed from yesterday?
My understanding was I don't think that testimony is considered the same, but I can clarify.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I have a question. I think the whole point of having the assistant commissioner on the board, the overall board, right? Because we're doing the subcommittee making recommendations to the board, and we already have a member of CSDE on the board. So thereby we are conferring and co-creating with CSDE because she's there representing CSDE. And I think we do need a little bit more clarification, but either way, we could still move forward with our work.
Yes.
Yeah, and Shannon's right. We can always just call a special meeting. Like they could easily call a special meeting to review our recommendation too. And we should probably refer to it as Raise Bill 1392, just so like public, it's clear.
Yes. And so I think in the original public act that gave us our authority, the 2441, I think it says that any legislation or regulations this board proposes has to go through the state board, and it gives the board a window to respond, but they could obviously respond faster, right? I want to say it was like a 60-day window, but that would be the difference between testimony to the education committee and, you know, making an actual legislative proposal or a change to regulations, because I think the testimony does not count as either of those two things, but I could be wrong.
I believe that's why the January 31st deadline was in there, because it was supposed to go to the Board of Education, not to a legislation. So my recommendation, we're talking about this, is simply to get the piece together and then, you know, send it off to the board. And at the same time, we can make it clear that we've responded to, you know, the requests from legislators as well. So let's at least get it done, and then where it goes, right?
Yeah.
So would we like to have further discussion on legislative proposal A?
I would. I mean, I think it's important to lay out process. I think the date is the big issue for me. You know, the minute you say 2026, it's like tanking it again. But I think in terms of making it clear that the board, that our CERT board would have the responsibility on either, you know, a 3-year basis or whatever, to review all of what it says, at least biannually, review and update its guidelines. So there's initiating a process as well as recommendations. But the idea behind the CERT board was to make sure that it was flexible and responsive to research and data. And I think that's important to name up front. It's just the date that's really got me sort of saying, ugh. I don't know that we need to do that.
I have the date as effective July 1st, 2025.
Oh, it says
And
26.
then,
okay,
so I'm reading the effective date versus when the guidelines would come out by.
Oh, okay. All right. But even that, I mean, I guess we have to have something in there. But I do think it's important to lay out process, because I'm not sure that everybody understands what the process. We want to keep clarifying that's what the board is doing. The certification board. So I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah, I think we need a little bit of clarification on those dates, because I seem to remember that 1392 was 2025, but in the work that we were looking at doing, we were 2020. So I say 1925, 2026. Am I tired? Let me get my coffee. Wait.
Well, I mean,
it says not later than that, though. So I think it does say that.
I do believe that, like, as the legislator, like people had shared yesterday, that in particular focus of the assessment of content knowledge, not all of our work, but just that piece. They were like, right. we want something by 2025, like to go in right. for the 25-26 kind of academic school year. And so that is what that is the piece about the 2025, not all of the work we're doing. And that is why we were supposed to get something in January to like right. make sure that the content knowledge piece, this kind of multiple pathways, was set in motion and would apply for aspiring educators going into the field in 2025. So can we talk about, I think, Anne, last time we met, you were bringing up, we've talked about like what the multiple pathways could be. Right. And I think, Kristen, you had some additional kind of questions and around like, just around that, can we kind of dig into like, where are we and what would we like to bring to our CERT board in terms of multiple pathways that could happen within this 2025 range that the legislators are very kind of focused on.
Mhm.
Can I make a recommendation? We already have, and I know it's on the agenda, but it's really to respond, Rebecca. We already started that with having that praxis bridge, right?
Yeah.
I think expanding that praxis bridge is key here. And I don't know that we have to. The other pieces, and I don't know. I know we have an agenda, but the other pieces expanding that. But do we have to stay with ETS? Like what? It's mandated we would go through praxis, but Pearson also has products. Like, can an institution, wherever it may be, can they decide, where they want to go, and can ETS offer this? And the other problem that we have is it's not ready yet. So ETS has to develop this product. We can't put something into legislator based on a concept, right? So I'm just kind of thinking we already have one thing that we can do, but that's only one certification area, right?
Well, can I jump in, or do you want?
Sorry,
I think go ahead.
I don't know if you can hear this, but there's like the loud welcome to school music going on behind me. Go right ahead, Anne.
So I think let me just sort of say what I'm thinking, and that we're all in agreement that Praxis 2 is the baseline. Everybody does it. If we look at the data that the State Department has, we're talking about a very small percentage of people whom we then have to address. I agree with you, Catherine. The bridge is already sort of agreed to by the State Department, but it's limited to elementary, although Praxis ETS is saying that they would develop more. The problem with going outside of it is we're talking about allowing this for one SEM response. In other words, you almost passed, and technically under statistics, you did pass, because you were within that one SEM. So giving those people that opportunity, that takes another percentage of people, but you had to have taken the praxis to use the bridge, right? So I'm gonna sort of sit on that and say, okay, praxis is talking about doing more. They're in it to make money. They'll probably come out with that, right? So we just have to be patient with that, but it's working for us for that one SEM group. So we could have that as an alternative, with the language that as Praxis comes out with more, we will allow that. The ones that are really sticky for me from the viewpoint of a dean and CAPE is the allowance of the what did we call it? the bachelor, the content area, and the observation and review. Portfolio option, if it's left to the EPP and they want to do the work, they know the candidate. If they have that option and they want to utilize it after praxis for those few students, I don't see a problem with that. They could even use EdTPA if they wanted to go back to it as a portfolio, but they'd have that option in their own, The big issue is the EPPs have to be responsible for this. Okay, there's the music, Kristen.
Yeah, it's really loud on my end.
But the EPP responsibility is a big one, because it gets really messy. For example, with the observation and review thing, like who's putting up for certification. It's really a mess. So anyhow, I'm jumping around, but I think
yes. So I would entertain a motion to table legislative proposal A, and then we can start looking at the alternative minimum content assessment options.
So proposed. How's that?
All right, we have a motion from Anne Deschelle.
Second.
Shannon? A second from Shannon Merriman.
Oh, no, I was going to
okay.
discussion. So second was Catherine, I think.
Second was Catherine. Okay.
Yeah.
Do we have any discussion in favor of tabling legislative proposal A, or any discussion about tabling legislative proposal A?
I think we had the discussion before the motion.
I think so too. Shannon?
Well, I think this is just procedural now. I think we're trying to figure out which item on the agenda we're discussing in what order. So
Yes.
if we're talking about the legislation, the one thing I just want to make the distinction of is the legislation in proposal A is incredibly permissive to then figuring out all the other stuff later. So I think there's like a point of order, and maybe we need to figure out the other stuff to make sure that we can back into A as the proposal we're comfortable with. So putting it now at the bottom of the agenda is fine mechanically for the purposes of today's meeting, but just keeping in mind that we are not actually putting the detail in the legislation by way of picking A as our legislative response, which does give us a lot of flexibility to think about moving all of these things or changing all of these things as we go. I mean, we don't want to go crazy, but I think it gives us breathing room. So I just want to point that out. If we got to a place at the end of today's meeting where we agreed that legislative proposal A was the way we wanted to go, we then could come with a first pass of recommendations for the guidelines, but we still have time to make those guidelines. I think the question would be then just dates in legislative proposal A for when those guidelines would need to be first finalized. So just making that finer point.
Thank you.
Discussion still?
Yes,
I'm
discussion.
not clear, Shannon. So you're saying, I thought we could have the process and the recommendations, because I think the legislators are looking for that. So, so we establish the process for guidelines, and here are the three that we're putting forth to start.
Sure, if we want to accomplish that, that's great, but it's well before that deadline of what's in there. I mean, I would push that deadline up for ourselves anyway, but just me thinking.
Dr. Rowe, and then let's get to voting on tabling this so we can get to the actual meat of it. Dr. Rowe.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if you heard the entire testimony yesterday. Our legislators were really clear that we missed the mark with the January 31st, which I don't think is fair because we didn't start in August like we were supposed to, and that wasn't really taken into consideration. However, I think the onus is on us to get a solution, because otherwise we're going to be given the solution based on yesterday's testimonies. Sorry about that.
Okay, so the motion on the floor is to table legislative proposal A, hopefully till the end of this meeting, but if not, till the next one. So the motion on the floor is to table legislative proposal A. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, lower your hands. All those opposed. Okay, and all those abstaining. All right, and it looks like motion carries. So let us go on to the next section, which is looking at the different options for alternate minimum content assessment. Give me one moment to make sure I get this document up so that everyone can see what we're looking at. Like Anne said, there were this section of Praxis 2 tests we're looking at is a small number. It's less. In 2022, the data from Ajit has 77 Praxis 2 tests that were never passed. And in Ajit's full document, not the presentation that he gave to us, but like the PDF that went with it, he clarifies that some of these Praxis 2s could have been taken by people who took the test repeatedly and failed repeatedly, people who were never enrolled in an EPP, or most likely at the beginning of their EPP program, and maybe they passed, or maybe they passed later. That it doesn't account for the other number of tests. So AFSTIL, Foundations of Reading, the Reading Specialist test, the Early Childhood test. There's a big list of required tests beyond Praxis 2. So I found 1, 2, 3. I found 5 options that were brought up either in legislation, CPRL recommendation, or the Practicing Bridge already being done. One I have on the list is the Joint Superintendent SDE observation. And this proposal is my proposal. So with this, and it's, I don't know, is everyone able to see this on their screen clearly?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so with my proposal, one of the things that I work with a lot is I work with people who are under DSAP. So they're hired in a school district, they've graduated their EPPs, they've taken their state mandated assessment, they were already hired, but then they find out they didn't get their minimum score needed for certification. And they wouldn't have the Praxis 2 bridge available in their content area because that's for so limited number of people. So my proposal was to have the prospective teacher meet this requirement as observed in a practical setting. Now, when they're hired under a durational shortage area permit or a non-renewable interim educator certificate, they're hired as full-time teachers, which means they go under the district's evaluation plan. They work with their supervisor, they make goals, they get observations, they get feedback, they get guidance. And when their supervisor determines that they're prepared, feels that they're prepared after at least one formal and one informal observation, my proposal was to have someone from the State Department of Education do a classroom observation of the teacher showing they can plan, implement, and reflect on an actual lesson in their content area with their students. And then after the superintendent, attests based on their supervisor's observation of their work, and the State Department of Education does their observation, that meets the minimum content area requirement. Rebecca.
Kristen, I love this is a creative idea and actually aligns to some of the things that Senator McCrory was saying about an observation as a for those who like you're saying are not in the bridge opportunity. I'm the logistics of it. I would definitely. I'm not sure a superintendent and a member of the Department of Education, particularly for our for our largest districts, that's going to be able to. Those particular logistics, but I think this is an interesting one to consider about an observation. So essentially saying everybody takes the praxis, and then there's the opportunity for a bridge for some, and there's an opportunity for an observation. And I also think there's other, not only DSAP, but then there's resident educator certificate. But I think those are some of the details that the State Department of Education can kind of suss out.
Thank you. Dr. Rowe?
So just to add a little bit of information, that when someone is in a durational shortage under that certificate, they are in a program. They're already in a program. So, and part of that program is, before they move into the classroom, is to have taken the content mastery. So the flow is not necessarily, I don't know that it would work, right? Because in my program, before they go into their student teaching, or they're supposed to have had that piece already completed. So I just want to bring that up. The other piece is, in the durational shortage certificate, they are observed, right? It's already involved, and it's already organized within the program, that they have university supervisor personnel that come in, and they also have the person on the other end in the school, the chair or whoever is in the school that we collaborate with, to provide that clinical mentoring. So those things are already in place for the durational shortage certificate. And I can't speak to residency or a different type of certificate, but I can speak to durational shortage certificates, because we do this. So I don't know that this model would actually, it might actually add a step for those folks. Anne's got her hand up. Sorry, Anne.
No, that's okay. That's all right.
Yes, Anne.
Kristen, I really appreciate thinking out of the box here, but the logistics of this in terms of CAPE accreditation and data is, as Catherine pointed out, is going to get really messy. For example, who then puts certification for the candidate? Who recommends? Right now, it's the EPP that recommends for certification. It seems like now under this, it would be either the State Department or the superintendent in the district. How does the EPP maintain the data on the candidates if I do everything for the candidate and then they go out and they're out in the field working maybe under a DSEP or maybe under something else, and then I can't even follow them up. It gets really complicated when you take the responsibility for this out of the hands of the EPP. And I also really question, I think it's well-intentioned, but the State Department is very limited in the number of people that they have available. That districts are well-intentioned, but it's really hard for them to pull off, legitimately supporting a candidate when they need somebody in the school. I just worry that it meets a short-term requirement solution, but the long-term quality is going to be difficult. And the staffing concern of this, the logistics of how many attempts do they get? What if they don't do well? What happens to them then? Who does that? I mean, there's a lot there that hasn't been considered, even though it's an idea. I think having three options, having praxis, a bridge, and maybe looking at the GPA transcripts, something like that, even a portfolio, that's 4 options. I mean, how many options do we need at some point? The key to me is keeping the responsibility for the assessment of the content in the hands of the EPP. They know the candidate best in terms of that.
So I just have a follow-up question, because as a classroom teacher and knowing that we have people working under DSAPs in our building who've already graduated their EPP, is it unique to your EPP that people with DSAPs are still enrolled in your program when they're teaching?
They get 3 years. They can work under a DSAP for 3 years.
Yes, they can.
Right? So that's the piece.
So I would think that
they haven't finished the program because they haven't done the tests and that kind of thing where you can put them up for regular certification.
So if they haven't passed the test and gotten their certification, are they enrolled in your program, still paying tuition for those 3 years?
No.
Tuition, no. Tuition, no.
No, but I do.
They're not taking any courses.
See, here's the caveat. Just so it's all about CAPE. All right, Kristen? And I'm sorry, Rebecca, I see you have your hand up. But CAPE expects our students to graduate and then be certified. So we have to be responsible for them. We have to have that data. We track those students for 5 years out. How many students come through your program and graduate? How many students come through your program and are recommended for certification? How many students come through your program and stay in the field? So this is all the data. So taking the onus off the EPP really does infringe the data that we can collect. I'm really sorry, Rebecca. I know I jumped in front of you. Sorry.
Rebecca.
I agree with what you just said, Catherine, about we need the data. And if I put my former principal hat on, the number of teachers who I was like, you are on a DSAP, you're doing great, you're struggling with this. I wish I could just observe you, and maybe with the EPP, this might be an option within EPPs to be able to do an observation, and this is part of their pathway into getting their licensure. So I mean, I don't think it's with everything else. They've got the praxis, we've got a bridge, but instead of a GPA, and maybe it's because I often work with career changers who like their GPA might be like 10, 15 years ago. Like there's things that like it might not, make sense that this would give people within the context of the choice of the EPP. I'm with you there, Anne. Like I do believe that this should be a choice of the EPP, but to be able to have the state saying, yes, an observation in whatever and however way we describe it here would be an option as well as within the context of multiple pathways.
Thank you. And I did have some listed drawbacks under here because, this would work for people who are already hired, right? It would work if you were hired under a DSAP, but there are some districts that might hesitate to hire someone under a DSAP or might worry that the person might not pass their assessments later. I noted that some educators may be in specialties that are not particularly suited to the type of observations that are common, but that some districts do have look-fors for SLPs, school psychs, school social workers, and other non-classroom but still certified teachers. And the SDE could work with what an observation of a school psychologist would look like, which would be different than like your regular classroom teacher look-fors. Another drawback is that if the subject, let's say that your year 1 of a DSAP and year 2, your subject area falls off the durational shortage area, then you would have to apply to a different type of license in order to continue working, in order to continue pursuing this route. And I did have this question about like, this is an additional responsibility for the district, which we know that the districts are overburdened. And then for the State Department, I did hear an interesting suggestion on this, that instead of having this be a State Department employee, this be something done through the existing team program. I'm not entirely sure about the logistics of it, but we have Dr. Rowe and then Dr. Ritchie.
Okay, I have 2 things. Kristen, I think that we're going to do some really good work here. And so thank you all. And I was thinking along the same lines. Some of our candidates work underneath the DSAP just because they just don't file the 170A to get the certification. I mean, sometimes they, and that's just the way that it is. I have candidates that graduate and a year later they'll say, oh, I'm getting around to filing for my certification. So, I mean, that happens. I don't think they're always under that DSAP because they didn't pass the content mastery. However, I am thinking about, and we're talking about those outliers, not the norm, but for those outliers that cannot pass that content mastery, whatever that is. And I do think only having praxis as an option is limiting. All right. Right. So I do think that that ETS piece is just boxed you into just that one product. But if somehow for that outlier who has tried the praxis, didn't pass, if they could then have a remediation plan built into that team. And I don't think that the State Department of Education has the capacity, nor do I think that the school districts at this point have the capacity. Everybody's under financial exigency. So how do we do this without putting the burden on anything and maybe just providing some kind of what's already in place that we can kind of piggyback and that we can meet this, because we do need to move forward with it. And I think that the bridge is an option. The portfolio is a huge lift. It's a huge lift. If we don't use EdTPA, EPPs do not have the resources to develop a portfolio system because it's got to be valid, it's got to be reliable for CAPE. So that means EdTPA. Then you're back to a $300 price tag. Who's paying for it? That is the barrier that we removed in our work last year, right? So maybe we could tease that idea about the team for those, only for those folks that are in the outlier population.
Dr. Ritchie.
Hi, thank you. I agree, and thank you, Kristen. There's a lot here to kind of ground in, like the seeds are planted and we can continue to work on it. I think the theme is consolidate where we can to align evidence of the mastery. I love the idea of using what's already in place, but bringing a team approach to it. So for example, when a student needs to have a differentiated learning plan, they're able to show mastery in a variety of ways. We're kind of on that same theme here. I was the one who spoke about team and the modules in team. Perhaps team could be used to have a module aligned to the content area in need of showing mastery. That would be, maybe nothing extra, something that's already in place, in motion, and has meaning. I also like the idea of taking a look at the teacher evaluation plans, because those just legislatively got changed, and they offer a lot of flexibility for the teacher to choose goals. There's no guarantee the teacher who is in need of improvement in certain content areas is going to choose that goal, unless that could be part of this kind of plan where we agree, because it has to be a mutually agreed upon goal between the teacher and the supervisor, that this is an area we're going to work together on to ensure mastery. You'll be supported. But I love the thought of, I'd rather see it in the classroom, because that's what matters. Anyone can write anything on paper and have a portfolio or a thought, but it's really the implementation and the magic that happens in the classroom that has to be evaluated. So in summary, if we kind of align a requirement or some piece of requirement through the teacher evaluation goal setting plan, then that would tag the supervisor or the administrator in the building to know what to look for. And then if we had a team approach with the EPPs to share all that data, so we have observational data, we have the aligned goal, we have the outcomes, and then the EPP can continue to be a partner with the school. Could there be a state department leader that comes down? I think there could be, but I also worry about that manpower and then the scheduling of that. Mm-hmm. But if there's a timeline of, perhaps within 2 years, with all this evidence collecting of in-classroom content delivery with success, then perhaps it's doable. But we have a ton of openings, especially in an opportunity district. And I don't think the state would have the manpower to do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Dr. I'm going to ask, thanks. I'm going to ask Anne to kind of help me to articulate this. Thank you. If I can call you Cynthia. Thanks, Cynthia, for that. I think that there's a couple of things here we have to watch, because the DSAP is only for 3 years. So if they're already in a DSAP for 2 years, we can't add another 2 years. So that's a little bit of so we have to look at that timeline. The other piece is we would have to have a feedback loop that would be legislatively mandated, so that the EPP does receive that data for their CAPE. And that this would be something that, I might even reach out to Milena and just ask her, how this would look, because
why does it have to be in why does it have to have a legislative mandate? Us as a certification board, the more it's by putting it in legislation as a mandate, the more we put there, we continue to create less flexibility. And so can you just explain that piece to me?
Well, the whole piece is going to go to legislation. So if we come up with a system and
right,
an alternate path, so if we come up with a system, it's all going to go to legislation. So if we have, I would be fearful to say we're going to have a team approach for one piece or as an option, and then not legislatively mandate that we would get the data. That would really be that could be problematic for EPPs when we are the ones who are issuing or approving DSAPs.
All right, so we have Anne.
I think the concern that I have is the standard is content assessment. It's not content implementation. It's content assessment. So when we're talking about the observing a teacher or under a DSAP, observing someone once or twice or whatever, how many times, how we're going to get the data back to the EPP. Is it going to be valid and reliable data? Because that's the only kind of data we can use to put into the CAPE piece. I mean, there's really actually just a lot of intricacies here that are going to be difficult to work out. The question of what if the candidate does not do well, even if we decided to do it this way, where does that leave that particular candidate? So the EPPs deal with this kind of thing all the time because under a DSAP, you still have to student teach. And so there's multiple observations that happen through student teaching already. And some of the programs require you to pass praxis prior to student teaching. We don't. We allow you to do it based on what we know of you and know the candidate. So again, I just feel like the complexity of this is going to be really difficult when you put it into the parameters of CAPE, reliability and validity, how many people are involved in recommending the candidate for certification. And given the small number of people we're talking about, I just think some of the other alternatives are going to be more, even the portfolio would be more easily implemented as an option for people who don't pass these tests, which then could be overseen by the EPP. I really think adding the responsibility level outside of the EPP is just going to get really messy and expensive and not consistent, depending on who's implementing it.
Thank you. Next up, we have Shannon, then Dr. Rowe, and then if we have time, I do want to look at the other proposals in the last few minutes. Shannon.
Yeah, I mean, I'm cognizant of time, and I kind of still just want to go back to this idea that as a first response, we can say that we are exploring these different options, but we have legislation that responds to the current placeholder language, which we don't love because it does lock us in a way that we're trying to do the opposite of. So I think we have a valid case to be making that we want to move to this more flexible language in the legislation, and the details will come after, although we want to paint a picture of what some of those details may look like based on the conversations that we're having. So legislators know that it's in good shape. Like we're putting it together and we would be on track to meet a deadline, whatever deadline we set for ourselves. But I will say, just in terms of the precedent around some of these things we're talking about, I really like the word system. And I think one of the challenges is that when we do chunk this out into little portions like we're doing, it loses sight of the bigger system. And we have an opportunity as a board to think that like DSAP doesn't have to be the way that DSAP is written right now. That is going to sunset. So when we say there's only 3 years on a DSAP, like it doesn't have to be that way. We can think differently about DSAP. We can think differently about career changers and what maybe they go through that could be different, which is already a precedent with the 098 certification, which doesn't require an EPP experience at all. And I don't want that to be the norm, but I think there's a place for that for certain career changers. So I just want to put that out there in the sense that I think this is I like this idea that Kristen has put forward, and it gives us it shows us what's possible, that we are no longer anchored to the existing regs. We get to really paint a new picture of what this system can look like, that can meet a lot of different needs. And that is going to be complicated. It's going to be messy. But we could build in that time for that by way of writing the legislation in the way that gives us that flexibility. So just one more pitch for like putting forward this legislation to get the ball rolling so that we give ourselves the time to figure out and iron out all these details.
I love the paint a new picture. I love that image that gives me. Dr. Rowe.
Thanks for redirecting me, Shannon. That was excellent. And I agree with you. All right. So I'm thinking, oh, we have 3 years for DSAP, but you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. What is the short certificate? I will say that, it's my understanding that the EdTPA really does lead nicely into a professional growth plan. And I don't know enough about TEAM to say whether or not it does provide that content mastery, but I know EdTPA did. That was a component on EdTPA that we did evaluate if the student was teaching and understood the content they were teaching. So I'm wondering, and I don't know, I'm not really asking the question, but I wonder if the team does evaluate for that. And again, that is only for a small population. I'm going to go back to what Shannon said, because I absolutely do agree. I think we're doing some really good work here. And I think that we're kind of onto something. We just got to tweak it a little bit.
Dr. Good.
I agree with Shannon, that was wonderfully stated. What would be your recommendation in terms of then what we would bring to our board to capture that sentiment that we could then potentially recommend to the legislators for this particular session?
I guess I guess that's we're kind of looping back to the proposal A. If we're feeling like that's getting close to what we would put forward, because right now it's just a mechanical thing. Like, we need language for a reaction to the current bill, and this language could be the answer to that with some tweaks. I do question the deadline. I think we would want to move that deadline up a little bit for ourselves, because we're butting up a little too close to the sunset date if we wait till July 1st, 2026. But I think that we give ourselves that as the first pass, and then present to especially our board, but then even to the legislatures, the list of things we are considering to be included in those guidelines, so that they know it's not a blank slate. We have a plan for things we're going to consider and potentially include in those guidelines. So it's a both and. It's, here's the legislation as we would like to see it written, and here is what we expect to see show up in those guidelines when we finalize them.
And then could we so I know we're close to time, would it be an option to put a motion in to bring proposal A
to the board,
the larger board, and then be able to explain yes, we still have so much to talk about, but this gives us the space to talk about it and make a decision and of those.
Yes. So I could make a formal motion in the light of time, because we have a meeting on Monday. So I would think we would want to bring, so I'd like to make a motion that we bring legislative proposal A to the full board for their consideration, although I would make the adjustment to the date being even January 1st, 2026, so that we give ourselves a buffer. But I don't know if we want to add that messiness into this motion or do that with the full board on Monday.
Yeah, I would second that motion.
Okay. And let me just make sure I have the motion right. So the motion is that our ad hoc committee brings legislative proposal A to the entirety of the CEPCB with the adjusted deadline of January 1st, 2026.
Yes.
All right. So it has been moved and seconded. Any further discussion?
I guess I just have a question. Could we, since we all seem to be in agreement for the praxis being the baseline that everyone does and then move to alternatives, does that need to be in, say, these? Do we need to include that? At least that's the one thing that everyone seems to not be arguing about.
I don't think we need to include that in this particular motion, but I know that our whole board took a vote on it. I don't remember if it was February or January, but I know our whole board did take a vote on whether praxis 2 or whether a standardized assessment would continue to be the baseline for all teachers who are looking to get certified. I know we took a vote on that before.
And that is, Anna, in this draft version, it says that it must include, but not be limited to, achieving a satisfactory evaluation on the State Board of Ed approved subject area assessment, which would be the Praxis 2 or other. I mean, there are others we could open it up to Catherine's point. It doesn't name Praxis 2, but whatever that State Board of Ed approved assessment is.
Okay, if I don't raise my hand, my only fear is, and I don't think if we have I think we need some specificity so that our legislators know that we really are having good conversations and that we have some kind of building blocks. We're not there yet, because I do think otherwise they will move forward other legislation and then makes this work mute.
Any further discussion? All right, seeing none, all those in favor of bringing, all those in favor of bringing A to the board with the adjusted deadline of January 1st, 2026, please raise your hand.
Yeah.
Okay, and put our hands down. It's harder to do online because you have to physically push the button to put your hand down. All those opposed? Any abstentions? All right, motion carries. So I will bring this forward to the certification board when I see everybody on Monday. I'll adjust the deadline in this proposed legislative motion. And then I'll outline that we've talked about a handful of ideas, but that we do want to spend more time looking over them in more detail. What I'm imagining, I don't know if you can still see this document that I'm changing my screen with, one moment, but what I'm imagining that our next work would be to go through the rest of the other suggestions for alternate minimum content assessment. I've started filling in some benefits for districts, for teachers, for implementation, and drawbacks for each of these different ideas. So I've started putting that together, but I definitely need your input because I see it as a classroom teacher that, through my work for the union, I see pre-K-12, but I don't necessarily see, the other side of it. I don't see the superintendent side. I don't see the EPP side. So I do want to get to looking at the portfolio option. I want to get to looking at the bachelor's degree. And it's funny because in different places, it's slightly different. So the portfolio, one of the ways was through EPP attestation, but another proposed way was through a Department of Education review panel of the portfolio. So there's a lot we still have to talk about, but I think that, if we can look at each piece, we can start to put together a big picture and decide what option we think is the best with all our feedback in there. Right? So with that being said, is there any discussion we want to have before we close the meeting?
I have a quick question. Is there anyone on the call that's team trained? I know you might have done completed train or best, but anybody team trained? That would be an interesting person to bring in to tease apart your idea, Kristen. Just throwing that out there.
No, thanks. And I have a few my colleague that sits right there is team trained. So I'll ask a few follow-up questions, but I think it might be helpful. Do you think it would be helpful if we get someone from the Department of Education that works with team to come speak to our ad hoc committee?
I think a team trainer would be, so yes, or somebody who trains
My wondering about that is a team, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe Cynthia, you have this. For educators going into the profession, like if they have not earned their initial educator certificate, are they still assigned a team mentor? Does anybody know?
Yes, they're assigned a team mentor.
Even if they do not have their initial yet.
No, when they're getting their initial, that's the first next step. They go through the team program.
Exactly. And so what we are talking about is demonstrating content knowledge before you've even been given an initial certificate. And so to have like the team conversation is like, that happens for those who, once you have gotten your initial, we're just like entry level at this point. So I think we need to understand who the customer, like who is the person we are speaking about, like versus we're not right now talking about the person after receiving their initial. Catherine?
But it could be that bridge. Like, so again, to think, it doesn't always have to be the old way. It could be a bridge of adding a module to what they need to bridge them into the traditional path for team. So just putting it out there.
Yeah. Okay.
No, I mean, like I'm going to go back to what Shannon said. What is team? I mean, we're doing everything. It's like we're creating something. So we're relying on team. But to your point, Cynthia, what is team? Team could be something that we're going to be talking about. And I did reach out to my team trainer in my district, and she said, no, it does not evaluate content mastery. So the team piece of it, at the way that it is now, does not. But to Rebecca's point, I mean, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be a new certificate in that gray area, quasi area between, graduation but I think that going back to what Ann said, it's not there, unless we come up with a completely new inception of what that is. At this point, it would just be super messy because we don't really know. We don't really know. We can't really get that data from the team at this point. So
yeah, I think I'm focusing on, while there's the item, whether it be a test or a team or an observation, I want us to also ground in the person. We have people that want to teach in our schools, and like, how are we supporting them through that?
All right, everyone. Well, thank you for your time this morning. I will see you all on Monday of next week. And then at some point, we should set up another meeting of this ad hoc committee so we can get to the other items on the list. But Chloe, do we want to do that by like email, letting you know availability?
Either email, or if we want to just have a quick little meeting right after Monday's meeting in person. Sometimes that's easier to just kind of like look at calendars. I was planning on asking both ad hocs to do that with me. Yeah, and then I have everyone talking at the same time. So.
All right, everyone.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you for your leadership. It was a great meeting, and have a great day, everybody.
Yep.
Thank you.
See you next week.
Thank you.
Bye.
bye. Thank you.